In 1942, a young Viennese psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl was arrested and deported to a concentration camp, along with his wife and his parents. He had, shortly before his arrest, finished the manuscript of a book he had spent years developing, a work that laid out a new approach to psychotherapy he called logotherapy. He had sewn the manuscript into the lining of his coat, hoping to smuggle it through with him. The coat was confiscated on his first day in the camp, and the manuscript was destroyed. Everything he had built professionally, along with nearly everything he owned, was gone within hours of his arrival. What happened next is the subject of the book he wrote after the war, in the space of 9 days from memory, reconstructing not just the manuscript he had lost, but something larger. An account of what he witnessed and endured across 3 years in Auschwitz and other camps, and the psychological theory he built, tested, and confirmed in the worst conditions a human being can be asked to survive. That book is Man's Search for Meaning, and it remains one of the most widely read works of the 20th century, not because it is a comfortable book, but because it answers, with unusual authority, one of the most important questions a person can ask. What allows a human being to endure suffering without being destroyed by it? This book is different in structure from most of the books we cover in this series. It is really 2 books joined together. The first half is a memoir, a spare and unflinching account of daily life in the camps, told not for the sake of documenting atrocity but to illustrate, through direct observation, a psychological argument. The second half is that argument made explicit, an outline of logotherapy, the school of thought Frankl built around a single central claim, that the primary drive in human beings is not pleasure and not power but meaning. In this video, I want to walk through both halves of the book together because they cannot really be separated. The memoir is the evidence, the theory is the conclusion, and by the end, I think you'll understand not just what the book argues, but why an argument built inside a concentration camp carries a weight that no comfortable armchair theory ever could. Let's start with the claim the entire book is built around. Frankl had trained under the 2 dominant schools of psychology of his era. Freud's view held that the fundamental drive in human beings was the pursuit of pleasure, that behavior could ultimately be explained by what he called the will to pleasure. Alfred Adler, who Frankl also studied under, argued instead for a will to power, the drive to overcome inferiority and assert oneself over one's circumstances. Frankl, watching human beings in the most extreme conditions imaginable, concluded that both were incomplete. What he observed, again and again in the camps, was that neither pleasure nor power explained who survived psychologically intact and who did not. What explained it was something else entirely. Whether a person could still locate a reason to keep going, a purpose that existed beyond their own suffering. He called this the will to meaning, and he argued that it is the deepest and most defining motivation in human life, more fundamental than the pursuit of comfort and more fundamental than the pursuit of dominance. This is not a claim Frankl arrived at from a comfortable office. He arrived at it while performing forced labor on starvation rations, while watching men around him die not primarily from physical exhaustion, but from a kind of psychological collapse that set in once they stopped believing there was anything left to live for. He describes this collapse with clinical precision. A prisoner would suddenly refuse to get up, refuse to work, light a cigarette they had been saving, and within a day or 2 they would be dead. Not from any new physical cause, from the loss of a future to live toward. The body, it turned out, could often survive longer than most people would expect, provided the mind still had somewhere to go. Once the mind gave up the future, the body followed with startling speed. This observation is the foundation for everything else in the book. Meaning is not a luxury that matters only once survival is secured. It is one of the load-bearing structures of survival itself. Now let's talk about where Frankl believed meaning actually comes from, because this is one of the most practically useful parts of the book, and one that separates it from a great deal of vaguer self-help writing on the same subject. Frankl identified three distinct paths through which a person locates meaning in their life. The first is through work, through creating something or accomplishing some task that matters to you. The second is through love, through the experience of genuinely encountering another human being and caring about their well-being for its own sake. The third, and the one Frankl spends the most careful attention on, is through suffering itself, when suffering is unavoidable, through the stance a person takes toward it. The first two are relatively intuitive. Most people can recognize that meaningful work and meaningful relationships contribute to a life that feels worth living. It is the third path that makes the book genuinely distinctive, because it addresses the question that matters most when circumstances cannot be changed. What happens to meaning when the first two paths are stripped away entirely, when there is no work worth doing and no one left to love, when a person is left with nothing but pain that cannot be avoided, escaped, or explained? Frankl's answer, developed and tested in the specific conditions of the camps, is that even then, meaning remains available, because a final freedom cannot be taken from a person no matter what is done to them. The freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose the manner in which one bears an unavoidable burden. He describes watching men walk through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread, and concludes that while the camps could take away nearly everything, they proved, definitively, that they could not take away this last inner freedom. Some men behaved like brutes, others behaved like something close to saints. The external conditions were identical. What differed was the attitude each man brought to those conditions. This is worth sitting with carefully, because it is easy to hear it as a kind of hollow inspirational platitude, and Frankl himself is careful to resist that reading. He is not arguing that suffering is good, or that it should be sought out, or that a person should be grateful for unnecessary pain. He is making a narrower and more precise claim, that where suffering is genuinely unavoidable, the way a person faces it, whether with bitterness and despair or with dignity and purpose, is itself an achievement. And one of the deepest sources of meaning a human life can contain. Suffering that could be avoided or reduced should be avoided or reduced. It is only suffering that cannot be changed, the diagnosis that cannot be cured, the loss that cannot be undone, where this third path becomes relevant, and where Frankl insists it remains genuinely available. Let's move now to one of the most quoted ideas in the entire book, which Frankl borrows directly from Nietzsche and builds his clinical practice around. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. This sentence functions almost as the operating principle of the whole book. Frankl observed, systematically, that prisoners who held onto some specific why, a manuscript they wanted to finish, a spouse they were determined to see again, a child who needed them to survive, endured the physical conditions of the camps measurably better than prisoners who had lost their sense of a reason to continue. This was not simply a comforting story he told himself. He treated it as a testable clinical observation, and he built an entire therapeutic method around the finding that psychological and even physical resilience is not primarily a function of the severity of what a person faces, but of whether they can locate something specific and personal that the future still holds for them. This leads to what might be the single most practically important reversal in the entire book. Frankl argues that the question most people ask about meaning is backward. We tend to ask, in a general and abstract way, what is the meaning of life, as though there were one universal answer waiting to be discovered, applicable to everyone in the same way. Frankl insists this question is malformed, Meaning is never abstract and never general. It is always specific, situational, and addressed to a particular person, at a particular moment, facing a particular set of circumstances. The question is not what does life mean in general. The question is what does life expect of me, right now in this specific situation. Life, in Frankl's framing, is the one asking the question, and the individual is the one who must respond, through action and through attitude, not through philosophy. This reframing matters enormously in practice, because it removes the paralysis that comes from searching for some grand, universal purpose before a person feels entitled to act. You do not need to solve the meaning of existence before you are permitted to find meaning in this specific day, this specific task in front of you, this specific relationship you are responsible for. Meaning is not discovered once in the abstract. It is discovered repeatedly, moment to moment, in the concrete particulars of a life, through the responses a person gives to what each situation specifically demands of them. Now let's turn to something Frankl describes with unusual psychological subtlety: the mechanism by which a person can maintain an inner life, even while their external circumstances are reduced to something close to bare survival. He describes from direct experience moments in the camp where he found himself thinking of his wife with an intensity and clarity that felt, in that moment, more real and more sustaining than the physical suffering surrounding him. He did not know at the time whether she was alive or dead. It did not matter for the purposes of what he was describing. The thought of her, the internal presence of her, was sufficient to carry him through specific unbearable moments, and he draws from this a conclusion that runs through much of 20th century existential thought: that love is one of the ultimate things a human life can be oriented toward, and that a person's salvation, in the deepest psychological sense, can run through the contemplation of someone they love, independent of that person's actual fate. He connects this to a broader capacity he calls self-transcendence, the human ability to reach beyond one's own immediate circumstances, whether through devotion to another person, or through commitment to a task or a cause greater than oneself. He argues that this capacity for self-transcendence, rather than self-actualization in the sense of simply becoming more fully oneself, is the actual engine of a meaningful life. Self-actualization, in his account, is not something a person can pursue directly. It is a side effect, something that happens as a natural consequence of a person giving themselves over to something or someone beyond themselves. Pursue it directly, and it recedes. Pursue meaning through genuine engagement with something outside yourself, and self-actualization follows as an unintended byproduct. This connects to one of the book's sharpest and most counterintuitive arguments about the relationship between meaning and happiness specifically. Frankl argues that happiness cannot be pursued directly, and that the attempt to pursue it directly is precisely what makes it unreachable. Happiness, in his account, must ensue. It is a byproduct of a life oriented toward something outside the self, toward meaningful work, toward people we love, toward values we hold. The moment happiness becomes the direct target of pursuit, it evaporates because the pursuit turns attention inward, toward one's own state, rather than outward, toward the task or the person or the cause that would actually generate the feeling being chased. He observed this same structural pattern in a specific clinical phenomenon he treated frequently: patients who could not sleep because they were trying too directly to fall asleep, whose anxious attention on the goal of sleep was the very thing preventing it. The same mechanism, he argued, applies to happiness, and to meaning itself in a subtler way. You do not find meaning by staring directly at the question of whether your life has meaning. You find it by turning your attention outward, toward the specific task or the specific person life is asking something of you right now, and meaning arrives, if it arrives, as a consequence of that engagement rather than as the direct object of the search. Let's talk now about a related idea Frankl developed to describe a very particular kind of psychological suffering that he saw becoming increasingly common, not in the camps, but afterward in the ordinary peacetime lives of his patients, what he called the existential vacuum. The existential vacuum is Frankl's term for the specific emptiness that results when a person has no sense of meaning to orient their life around, an emptiness that manifests not as acute crisis, but as a persistent, low-grade boredom, a restlessness, a feeling that nothing in particular matters more than anything else. He observed this becoming more prevalent as industrialized societies solved many of their material problems, freeing people from the immediate demands of survival that had previously occupied most of their attention, and leaving many of them with a kind of psychological vacancy where those demands used to be. He describes a specific manifestation of this he called Sunday neurosis, the particular despondency that sets in for some people at the end of the working week, when the busyness that had been filling their days falls away, and they are left alone with the question of whether any of it matters. Frankl saw the existential vacuum as one of the defining psychological conditions of modern life, underlying a great deal of what gets treated, often unsuccessfully, as depression, addiction, or aimless dissatisfaction. His treatment of it was direct and consistent with everything else in the book. The vacuum is not filled by more comfort, more distraction, or more acquisition. It is filled only by the rediscovery of one of the three paths to meaning he identifies, through renewed engagement with meaningful work, through genuine relationships, or, where suffering is present and unavoidable, through the stance a person chooses to take toward it. Now let's spend some time on something the book addresses directly, because it is the most obvious objection a careful reader might raise. Doesn't a theory built on finding meaning in suffering risk glorifying suffering itself, or excusing away pain that should instead be fought against and reduced? Frankl anticipates this objection and answers it with more precision than is often credited to him. He explicitly states that unnecessary suffering is not meaningful and should be reduced or eliminated wherever possible. A person suffering from an illness that has an available treatment should pursue that treatment. A person suffering from a fixable injustice should work to fix it. The meaning available through suffering applies specifically, and only to suffering that is genuinely unavoidable, the suffering that remains after every reasonable effort to change the circumstances has been exhausted. In those specific and narrow conditions, and only in those conditions, Frankl argues that the attitude a person adopts toward what cannot be changed becomes itself a meaningful achievement, potentially the deepest one available in that moment. This is a much narrower and more carefully bounded claim than the popularized version of the idea often suggests, and understanding the boundary is essential to understanding what the book is actually arguing. He develops this into what he later called tragic optimism, the capacity to say yes to life in spite of everything, including suffering, guilt, and death, the three things he identified as the fundamental tragic elements of human existence that no amount of progress or good fortune can permanently eliminate. Tragic optimism is not naive positivity. It does not deny the reality of suffering, guilt, or mortality. It is the specific psychological stance of finding, or creating, meaning even in their presence, of turning suffering into some form of human achievement, turning guilt into an opportunity to change oneself for the better, and turning the transience of life into a motivation to act meaningfully within the finite time available, rather than a reason for despair about that finitude. Let's turn now to the practical method Frankl built out of all of this, the therapeutic approach he called logotherapy, because the book is not only a memoir and a philosophy, but also, in its second half, a working clinical framework. Logotherapy, distinct from the psychoanalytic approaches Frankl trained in, is oriented toward the future rather than primarily toward the past. Where classical psychoanalysis often focused on excavating childhood causes of present distress, logotherapy focuses on the meaning a patient might find or create going forward, treating that search for future meaning as itself therapeutically active. Frankl describes it as helping a patient see their own life's task, the specific, concrete, personal thing that only they can fulfill, and helping them recognize that no one else can take up that task on their behalf, which gives their continued existence a specific, irreplaceable weight. One of the specific clinical techniques Frankl developed from this framework is what he called paradoxical intention, a method for treating anxiety and phobic conditions by having a patient deliberately and even humorously wish for the very thing they fear, momentarily revering the anxious avoidance that typically reinforces the fear. A patient afraid of sweating in public, for example, might be instructed to try to sweat as much as possible, which frequently and reliably interrupts the anxious spiral that the fear of sweating itself was producing. The technique reflects the same underlying insight that runs through the whole book, that direct pursuit often defeats itself, whether the object of pursuit is sleep, happiness, or the avoidance of a feared symptom, and that a kind of indirect, even paradoxical redirection of attention is often more effective than confronting a problem head-on. Before we move toward the closing sections, it's worth addressing directly what makes this book different from the enormous volume of other writing on meaning, purpose, and resilience that has been produced since. Most such writing is theoretical, built from observation of ordinary life, or from academic research conducted under ordinary conditions. Frankl's account was built and tested under the most extreme conditions available to a human observer, in a setting engineered specifically to strip away every source of dignity, comfort, and hope a person might rely on. The theory survives contact with that setting, not as an abstraction that happens to sound plausible, but as a description Frankl watched play out repeatedly in the actual behavior of actual people facing actual starvation, actual violence, and actual death. That is what gives the book its distinctive authority, and why it has remained in continuous print and continuous relevance for more than 70 years since its first publication. Let me close with the idea the book keeps returning to beneath all its specific arguments, the one Frankl seems to want a reader to carry away above everything else. Meaning is not something a person is handed, and it is not something that arrives once conditions become comfortable enough to allow for it. It is something each person is responsible for discovering or creating, specifically and personally, in the actual circumstances of their actual life, including the circumstances that are difficult, unwanted, and impossible to change. Life is not obligated to make sense to you in the abstract. It is asking something of you, specifically today, in the particular situation you are standing in right now. And the answer you give, through what you do and through the attitude you bring to what you cannot do anything about, is the only meaning available to you, and it is. According to everything Frankl witnessed, and everything he built from what he witnessed, enough. The people who survived the camps psychologically intact were rarely the strongest, the healthiest, or the most fortunate. They were the ones who could still locate something, however small, that the future asked of them, and who chose to walk toward it. That capacity, Frankl insists, is not reserved for extraordinary circumstances. It is available in the ordinary difficulty of an ordinary life, in the work you have not yet finished, in the people who are still waiting on you, and in the way you choose to carry whatever cannot be set down. Thanks for watching all the way through. Find your why, carry your how.